Welcome to the DevRe podcast.
Joining me on the DevRe podcast today, I have Charlie Ill. For those of you that are new here, I've only spoken to Charlie quickly on the phone as a brief introduction, so I'm really meeting him for the first time today, along with all of you listeners. So I'll let Charlie take it away.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Let everyone know a bit of a background about yourself, who you are, how you started, where you got to, and then we can take it from there.
Sure, fantastic. Okay, well, so I'm Charlie. I'm the CEO of Investible. We're an early stage venture capital fund with offices here in Sydney and as well as in Singapore. And there's some very unique qualities of Investible that I believe your listeners will be particularly interested in, specific to how we can offer founders cut through to specific customers and industry more effectively than most, as well as continuous capital into the very late stages. But background about myself, venture capital, over a decade in venture capital across 3 different regions. Australia being one of those, Southeast Asia, specifically Singapore being the second, and then out of the Middle East, specifically Oman with a sovereign wealth fund out of the Middle East. So glad to be here today, and thanks. Really looking forward to this conversation.
So what got you into the venture capital space?
So my background was engineering. Grew up in the States, spent studies in Los Angeles as a mechanical engineer, and worked for a company that grew through acquisition. And while I was placed in a role that would look after, in many cases, the restructure or some of the process improvements in the newly acquired businesses, I was looking at the other side of the table at the investment bankers, and it was a different type of work, but a very interesting bit of work for me. So took my passion for technology, combined it with an interest in business, and then explored venture capital in Asia Pacific and this part of the world.
Okay, so it's an interesting sort of pivot there. Yeah, I'm sure there's probably some lessons you could take along with process-driven background.
It was. Oh, 100%. I mean, look, the engineering education was one thing. The comfort with technology. The business I used to work in was aerospace, military defense. Particularly, we were working with some very interesting advanced materials and components that gave me a real lens into what advanced technology can be and its capabilities. And observing that was particularly that was, I think, the genesis of where my interest lies. Now, I also lived overseas as a kid, and Asia at this time, Singapore was the place to be. It was always Hong Kong or Singapore, and through my mentors, they had strongly recommended Singapore as a place to start a career if you want to do business in Asia Pacific. So that's where I aimed to go, and that's where I landed. My first job in VC was out of Singapore.
Okay, yeah, they really turned into a hub, not just for the flight, but just in the tech space and investing space. It's really like the central hub in Southeast Asia if you're looking at anything.
Absolutely. And they don't do anything slow. I mean, it is quick. So I recall back in would have been 2013. Yep. 2013 is when I started. And there were probably 7 to 8 really, truly active, purebred VCs there. Now there's hundreds of them. And the amount of events and startups, it's astronomical. And the way it works is very much the government's efficient, and so they get involved, and they incentivize the private market to get involved, and the private market then becomes very efficient because the processes and regulations are light touch and pro business.
Yep.
So the whole thing really operates. You can set up a company in Singapore in I think 2 weeks these days, something like that, with very little cash, and so it becomes a hub.
Yeah, the government's really driven that tech hub.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, it was, the saying is Singapore Inc., and that's part of it. I mean, the government operates like a business, very efficient, very, and pulls the right levers. So 100%. Yeah.
So we've had a little bit of an insight into that market. So we were working with a fintech out of Singapore called CrediLink. I was the acting CTO initially when they got off the ground, when it was just a pitch deck. And then we had our team come in as a tech team, and then we transitioned to an internal team. So I've seen a couple investors come in and have chats with the team and talk to it, but then understanding the journey that they've gone through and now that they're going through towards a Series A as well. So there's very light summary of what I've seen, but I can imagine how fast paced it is with the amount of people that are there as well as trying to get deals, and you're probably competing with others as well.
Yeah, well, so from a tech development point of view, so I can reference Singapore. I'll go into some detail here if that's okay.
Yeah.
So from a tech development point of view, it was there. There is a particular speech that stands out in my mind that the government leadership, and I believe it was even Lee Kuan Yew, was quoted to say, "We're not going to be able to compete with our neighbors based on volume or production or cost of production. So what we're going to do instead is compete on technology and innovation." And that's when he then decided to direct significant portions of the country's GDP towards the creation and innovation, or the creation of innovation. And so any Singaporean that goes through the education system there is highly credentialed, and very focused on the STEM activities in particular. There then is the research institute, similarly to Australia's version of CSIRO. They have their own called A Star, and then and so what they then ended up doing was, through that innovation, they then sat on quite a bit of innovation, but it wasn't commercializing. So then the government decided, okay, now we're going to be the best in commercializing these technologies, and that's when they started to offer very attractive incentives for local VCs to take greater risks on deep technologies. And so now Singapore, fast forward to today, Singapore is one of the best locations for deep technologies, and the production of it. And it's relevant to the tropics. It's relevant to the immediate issues that they're trying to solve. But that entire industry is of national importance, and so they have a lot of energy and resources that are directed towards future-ready jobs, future-ready startups, and applicability to their part of the world and the region and their neighbors around them. And that's how they spread their influence. As their companies do business overseas, next door necessarily, but it is overseas in some cases, that influence spreads. And Singaporeans are welcome, and do, and expand their businesses within Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and it's great foresight that they had to position themselves there because they knew that they couldn't compete on the per dollar hour rate of Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand, like the very close neighbors.
That's right. That's right. And they did decide to develop innovations that were relevant to them. Right. And that
Yeah.
was quite unique as well. So they directed a lot of attention to self-reliance. So a lot of water technology
Hmm.
comes out of Singapore, some of the best in the world, because they realized that they can't rely necessarily on their neighbors for a constant supply of water. The same is true for food production. um, you know, Through the attrition of their very small geography, they had to innovate smart ways on distribution of energy. So they have very clever smart grid technologies, and are fairly advanced in those categories as well. So it was those types of technologies. Health is another major for them. Not only, mosquito-borne diseases, which are an issue for the tropics, but other things. But they would look at and this was very clever of them. They look at the top 5 diseases that Singaporeans would suffer from. They say, okay, we're going to direct our attention to go solve those things,
Yeah.
and the entire industry moves to go solve those things because the government has been consistently reliable in incentivizing and continuing to incentivize solution making in those categories.
Yeah, because without the incentivization, then there's no like one private organization may then decide to do something about it and reap the benefit, but it may be over a very long time. There's going to be less innovation, less cooperation between those firms as well, less joint ventures trying to actually move faster.
For sure. And from the perspective of from my point of view as well, I've worked in countries where the government's been the same position and in the same power for, a very long time, regardless of and so there isn't a flip flop of priorities or strategy when a new party comes into power. That strategy stays consistent and stays focused.
Yeah.
And that's been one of, I think, Singapore's greatest advantages when it comes to creating an efficient government.
If you're looking at in venture capital space, you're looking at tech startups or any sort of startups, entrepreneurs or founders, they may start in sort of like a little bubble on their own, But then that's where those viewpoints are important to come in, get advisors, get the investors or venture capitalists on board, and start providing direction, feedback, having mentors and people on the board to help provide that extra feedback to push the product where it needs to go to find that right market fit. So it is important to have that in place.
Have good mentors. Absolutely. Our business is built on that. So Investible has combination of fixed end funds as well as an evergreen angel syndicate on the side. The way that we complement our founders' ability to grow their business is by placing mentors with them. These are our most active LPs. So our most active limited partners, they themselves have been individually successful. The reason why they're our investors is because they are successful in their own right, running
Yeah.
their own businesses, whether they were tech entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in a different type of industry. Um, Getting them to work closely with the founder is a extremely powerful superpower for the founder, because these folks who have paved their own paths and developed their own networks are then able to transfer that knowledge and those introductions to the founder, and it gives founders better cut through in the industry. That's very important. Founders must surround themselves with the right type of people and the right mentors. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, because you get a lot of people that try to mentor people but haven't had the success in business. Even if it's not at the level where they've had exits and at scale, you have some business coaches, as an example, who come in and try to be a mentor on a per hour basis, but they haven't had the success or the experience to actually try and pass that on to the people they're mentoring the right way. So I think the model you have is sounds really good, and that's provides you the value of leveraging someone else's mistakes and experience to try and get us multiple
Oh,
steps ahead, not just one.
100%. 100%. And and as well as a founder grows a business from an early stage to a late stage, the types of advice that that founder requires is going to vary. It depends, right? And so the founder in the early stages may, their priorities may be about customer acquisition. Although I think a founder's priority is always customer acquisition, but it may be about product development. Whereas in the late stages, a founder's priority may be mergers and acquisitions. What we're able to do is place advisors, mentors with these founders, and then tailor their needs as they grow as a company based on the roster or the bullpen that we have in house. So we're able to then make those solve those problems for our founders.
Yes, so as the founders grow, their business grows, then different mentors will come in based on those different rounds or scale that they get to.
100%, hundred
Yeah.
percent. And as mentioned earlier, this is the quality of the advice is paramount to your point. So the quality of advice is absolutely paramount, and and taking on a number of different mentors, and we encourage our founders to always do this. Surround yourself with smart people, right? Get advice where you can. We'll be able to provide some of it through the mechanisms and infrastructure that we have,
Hmm.
but always surround yourself with smart people, and look for views that are different to yours, right? Because you need to be challenged as a founder as much as you need people that are cheerleading you along the way. So it's a combination of both that
Yeah.
makes a great founder.
Yep. And we see with a lot of the founders that we work with in trying to develop just the very early stage MVP or basic prototypes that a lot of them have an assumption of what the product should look like and how it should work. And that's generally quite different when they actually start investigating their customers and their stakeholders to what they actually want. Sometimes it's very aligned, sometimes it's quite different, or they're on
Yep.
the right path.
Yep.
But there are the founders that don't take that advice on board or feedback and pivot the right way, and they just keep going down the wrong path. Do you see that coming through a lot?
100%. I mean, look, one of the elements for us, the reason why this angel syndicate is a syndicate before we place the members is because oftentimes a founder should not take advice from someone that doesn't have skin in the game, right? And they, so someone who stands to win or lose is I would argue one of the better types of mentors that founders should have in their roster. Um, there will be a number of people that have 1,000 ideas, but if they don't stand to lose from bad advice, I would take that advice with a fine grain of salt.
Yeah, so it's there are a lot of people giving out opinions
Yeah,
in another
everyone's
way of
got an
putting it.
opinion.
Yeah.
But the people who stand to lose are the ones that'll be very measured in the advice they give.
Yep. So, with the founders, entrepreneurs that come to you and you get involved with them, at what stage are they coming through to you?
They come to us at the pre-seed seed stage. So what that means is there are two entrepreneurs in a garage. They've got a couple customers, early traction, and they come to us and they say, "Look, I got a product in market. I got some early traction. Look how great my customers are interacting with this product. I need more money to sell to more customers."
Yep.
And that's essentially the main thing. If you are now, it varies, right? So if you're talking about a software company, that traction is a little bit more developed. We would have enough information to draw conclusions from those early adopters based on the retention rates or the
Mhm.
usage of those products. Um, Whereas we also have deep tech companies, heavy hardware types of companies as well, advanced materials, that sort of thing. Those companies, the founders will come to us and that traction will be quite light. They'll say, "Look, I've got one customer and I'm developing the pilot right now. This is how my product behaves in a lab. We believe that with sufficient evidence that if we scale this thing up, it'll function the same way. So we're going to do our pilot with our customer and we need capital for the deployment of that pilot." So it varies depending on the type of customer, or I'm sorry, the type of startup, but that's the ballpark
Yep.
generalities.
So the software startup, it's generally it's a lower barrier to entry to get software out to the market. I'm assuming that's why you probably look for more customers and recurring revenue coming through the business rather than sort of that hardware tech where it's a bigger investment to get a hardware developed.
That's right. That's right. And so the amount of money that we would put into each of these startups doesn't vary. And typically we find that startups in well mature VC ecosystems tend to ask for the same amounts of money ballpark, at this stage.
Yep.
And so there's a little education that needs to go into the founders to really prosecute if that's the exact amount of money that they actually need. And oftentimes, when we have our initial conversations with these founders, those amounts change.
Hmm.
Um, but all in all, our investment amounts are part of a greater syndicate of VCs that surround a company because, in our opinion, it takes a village to raise a startup. And so we actually encourage syndication of VCs.
Yep.
And so we will be one check among many that fill out that round.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, and look, the due diligence changes as well. So when we talk about hardware in particular, or advanced technologies, we're spending a lot more time assessing whether the technology works.
Yep.
Whereas on the software side, there is an element of that still occurs, but we are focusing more of our due diligence on what do the customers think.
Yep.
And I mean, it's true for both. What do the customers think? But the amount of information that we can gather on a software company of what customers think is far more advanced um, and objective because it's numbers. At the end of
Yep.
the day, it comes down to numbers. Whereas on the hardware side, those numbers come out of the tech due diligence in
Yep.
particular.
And then on the software side, like if you're looking at a SaaS product, it could be run a few $1,000s of marketing, get a big bunch of users in, and then build up that data set. Whereas on the hardware side, the actual cost of the hardware may be prohibitive for someone to purchase it initially. So to build up the same data set or the same number of users providing feedback is going to be quite different and quite expensive.
For sure. That said, a lot of hardware and advanced technologies comes out of the university scene,
Yep.
and universities have a lot of underutilized assets and labs and help these founders develop these technologies through those mechanisms and schemes. And there's grants and everything else as well. So
Yep.
so the pathway to our stage is nuanced and different. To your point, software entrepreneurs can program from their home.
Yep.
Um, Hardware or advanced technology entrepreneurs, oftentimes they're spending most of their time in a lab
Yep.
before they come to us.
Okay, so it's quite different, and there's different approaches for them. Working in the three different geographies as a VC, what have you sort of seen in the mindset of the startups or the founders that are coming to you in those different geographies? Because I'm assuming that's going to be quite different based on the cultural differences that we have
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. The VC ecosystems, as they mature, the types of solutions that are developed um, run similar pathways. So the first type of software solutions, and it's usually software to start because it's the easiest to develop.
Hmm.
Um, so the first things that come out are your traditional classifieds. Buy a car, buy a house, right? So it's your car listings, your house listings, your eBays or lookalike eBays of the world. Um, those are the first ones off the rank. And then those start to specialize. So actually your classifieds are even more general. It's buy stuff or get a job. And then it narrows. Okay, now buy a car, buy a house, and it specializes. But then it starts specializing again into other consumer facing types of solutions that specifically solve problems that the local populations are experiencing. So, for example, there will be, um, um, and they are nuanced culturally as well because they have to work within the confines of what are the norms of that society as well. And so there will be, it's a good example.
I was saying, like in Singapore, you've got Uber came in the market, but Grab is the one that took over.
That's right. That's right. It's a great example, right? And so the lesson in that case study is that, a solution, just because a solution works for one part of the world doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for another. And another mistake that a lot of founders assume is just because it works in Singapore doesn't mean it's going to work in Thailand or Vietnam, right? Southeast Asia or the Middle East is not homogeneous. And so there are nuances in each of these problems. And so founders then start to focus on the immediate societal, trying to solve societal issues through consumer facing software. After that, you then start to emerge into B2B because people start thinking, well, if I can fix problems using software that fix something I experience every day in my daily life, I can do it for professional life as well. And so each of these ecosystems, they go classifieds, they go then specific, sector specific classifieds to consumer facing that solve specific problems. And then they go into B2B. Middle East, for example, to give you an example of that one where they solve specific problems, education. Education is, ed tech solutions pop up very early in a startup ecosystem
Okay.
because a lot of entrepreneurs are parents and they want to do right by their kids and give them the best opportunities of success. And also in emerging ecosystems as well, you oftentimes observe that education, in a better education, is still well and truly a way to uplift your quality of life. And so there's always a lot of focus very early on in a VC ecosystem or startup ecosystem that's directed towards education. Um, and then there's other things as well. So we look at we did this in Oman actually. We looked at the some of the socioeconomic or macro data in Indonesia, and we're able to draw parallels with that to say Pakistan. And we were able to identify that the demographics were quite similar, where Pakistan was perhaps trailing Indonesia in approximately 7 to 10 years on those sorts of demographics. And so, what were the types of startups that were successful in Indonesia? We should try and find similar solutions in Pakistan today,
Okay.
right? Because we anticipate that in 10 years from now, they will be the unicorns of Pakistan, just like Indonesia had those as well. But then from a cultural nuance, you needed to look at South Asia and other countries in South Asia to see whether those types of solutions fit well within its society. But that sort of stuff is largely led by the founders. They themselves would know, what's best for their ecosystem. And what our job is to do is compare as many solutions as possible to solve that same problem and then identify the best option and run with that.
It's an interesting model there to compare the geographies and see how similar they are, how far behind, to then try and get ahead of what's coming in the next wave effectively.
Yeah, well, we try, right? If we were good at it, I'd be on a beach somewhere.
Oh, it's everyone trying, but it's an approach. It's data driven. It's methodical. You've got data points to then compare and validate against, and then now you've got a basis for some research and exploration to then compare. Does this fit the market? Let's do some
That's right.
feedback, get feedback, and explore the market, not just take X and put it in Y and see if it works.
That's right. And look, in invest at Investible, we're very data driven. So what I've given you is intel and experience based on the previous life, but Investible itself is highly data driven.
Yep.
And so we sit on 10 years worth of data from combination of tests that we ask the founders to go through, including a psychometric test as well. And so we're able to identify patterns in our selection process. And because of the nature of venture capital, where a significant proportion of your portfolio will ultimately fail, you don't necessarily want to use that information to avoid the failures, but rather to identify the successes. And how do we replicate success using that data, that information, those patterns? And Investable's quite good at that because of the volume of information that we've accumulated since inception.
Yeah, because what that may help you do is, if there wasn't a startup that was going to fail, you could probably course correct it potentially if they align to something you've seen in the past rather than trying to avoid failures, because it only fails up to a certain point.
It's very difficult to avoid failures. It's a lot easier to promote successes where you can,
Yep.
or complement what is already successful in many cases. So absolutely, and the types of information that we're able to gather and why founders would consider this quite important is in our orientation, we will demonstrate to the founders the information we've developed, right? Know thyself, right?
Hmm.
So we would introduce, hey, we would reason with the founders or discuss with the founders, look, we've identified these types of gaps. Let's try and introduce a mentor, an advisor from our club that's going to complement what you do and bolt them on to your business. And hopefully that can then fill in the areas that we believe would make you a more successful company.
Yeah, and
Um,
from what I've heard, that
but
unique approach is going to be beneficial to the startup without a doubt.
Well, sometimes we get it wrong. I'm not going to say that we get it right every time, but it is always in consultation with the founder.
Hmm.
Founder needs to be bought into this thing because it's their business at the end of the day. We're
Yep.
just there to support. So we do our best to support where we can, and that's one of those areas. And it's very data driven.
And I think having the structure you have with the syndicate, where you're all there on the same journey, is good, and being able to place mentors where needed is more beneficial than someone going to do a round and then getting 20 disparate investors who do not communicate with each other, all pushing their own agendas, trying to protect their own book.
That's right.
That's going to be a much more disjointed journey for the startup to then try and figure out which of these 20 people do I listen to now, because they're all telling me something different because they're all protecting their own interests.
Well, no, I would challenge.
No.
I think any VC that invests in a startup is aligned to the success of that startup and wants to do best intentions, wants the company to do well. Um, uh, there is and the transaction's been concluded, so there is no opportunity for the VC to necessarily maximize based on the last transaction.
Yep.
So at that point in time, the VCs sit down and that's probably one of the best parts of venture capital is that founder gets to surround themselves with other people who have skin in the game, that have lots to lose if the company does poorly and lots to gain if the
Yeah.
company does well.
I agree with you saying that they're all there for the startup to achieve success, but they'll all have different opinions because they'll all be coming from a different angle, different direction, different pivots
Sure,
that they want to do. That's sort of where
sure.
I'm thinking will probably be different to your approach, the approach that you take with your
Oh yes,
organization, and having the
Absolutely.
mentors there as the guide step to not control, but provide one or a few separate viewpoints as opposed to the 20 different viewpoints.
Correct. Ours is a unique viewpoint because of how we because of how we're able to provide it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's always the right viewpoint either. And
Yeah.
so it's up to the founder to determine good ideas from bad. And this is why we encourage founders to surround themselves with great mentors, those that challenge and those that cheer. You need both. And so we provide a viewpoint with the information we collect. We tend to think it's good intel, and we try to Um, but but we're not set in our ways either. The founders, if they give us sufficient evidence to suggest that it's a bad advice, we'll take it. you
Yeah.
know, it's
and,
okay. It's
and
okay.
you need that back and forth, and like you said, someone to challenge and to
100%.
cheer you. Otherwise, ideas will just go through and they won't be thought through. You won't be assessed, and you may not see what the other way of doing something, which may be potentially better, or
That's
knowing
right.
it's worse and discarding it for the right reason.
That's right. And we keep talking about ideas, whereas the real I think nugget or key for success is execution. And so we have the ideas discussion, but we got to get to done as quickly as possible on the idea side
Hmm.
so that we just execute and then we don't look back, right? You'll learn some things, but you move.
Yeah.
And that's what's really important with these founders. So execution is key. And that's why when we place people, we try and place people that rank highly in our tests on execution.
Yep. So just probably one last question before we wrap up. I'm just
Sure.
conscious of time. With having going back to the three different geographies, and we've worked not with knowing probably near as many startups and founders that you have, but there's a specific mindset that we've seen that they have in Australia. How does that sort of differ to Singapore and Oman with the way that the founders approach trying to be a startup?
So it's a good
Because
question.
here in Australia, there's sort of two that we've worked with. You've
Okay.
got, I'm a tech bro. I want to be the next Facebook overnight, and everything's too slow. And then you've got the other ones which are slow, methodical. They've been successful in something. They know how to build a business, and then they approach it, and they just want to provide value and help people. So there's probably the two main categories I can put them into.
Okay. Um, I don't necessarily see that as much. I think for us, a consistent trait across any entrepreneur we've come across in any geography is their passion for solving the problem.
Hmm.
Um, that's quite obvious. I mean,
They
you got to
wouldn't be
remember
there
these guys
otherwise.
are. Sorry.
They wouldn't be there otherwise. They wouldn't be in that position.
That's right. And yeah, these entrepreneurs are are working nights, weekends. They're putting other priorities aside to build this thing into a success. And so that's one of the, I mean, if you were to condense, entrepreneurs in some way, you look for skin and skills. Do they have the skills to grow the business and do they have skin in the game? Can they demonstrate sufficient skin in the game? And it's oftentimes a trade-off between personal life and work-life balance.
Hmm.
It can also be a trade-off based on personal investment, right? Entrepreneurs put their houses on the line. They put their life savings, that stuff that could have gone to a child's education because they believe that this is a greater probability of success and that they'll be able to get there. So that's a trade everywhere. I think there's a level of resource that is different in, say, Australia and Singapore to other parts of, say, other parts of the world. Um, Developing a startup in a developed country means that there's a lot more grants, just generally resources available. It's a lot easier for an entrepreneur in, say, Australia to walk down the street and talk to a venture capitalist because they congregate within, only a few major cities in
Yeah.
Australia. Um, Whereas in other parts of the world, even in very, very popular cities, there aren't that many VCs and there aren't that many government grants or resources at universities. And you will find that some of the more, and this is not my quote. This is someone else's, but it rings true for me. Um, Founders without resources are oftentimes the most resourceful, right? And everyone knows that. That's it. Well, I don't know if everyone knows that, but that is a popular quote that I've heard on occasion, and I think that's very true. I think that's very true. There are certain jurisdictions that I've done business in where the founders are putting things together with rubber bands and paper clips, and oh my goodness, the solution is fantastic,
Yep.
right? And it does the trick, and it's cheaper and it's
Hmm.
faster, and you know we got to get this thing to market as soon as possible.
Yep.
Um, there are a lot that surprises that way, but there are limitations to lack of resources as well. and the availability of deep technologies coming out of, really science fiction stuff you don't necessarily get in those parts of the world, but you get some really great stuff. So I think that'd be the difference on the founders, is how they solve the problems.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
the types of problems that they solve are slightly nuanced depending on their environments as well.
Yeah. There's
So, and
often
we covered
problems,
that a little bit on the cultural
yeah,
side.
that relate to them or
Yeah,
their area, their country.
that's right. That's right. But it's interesting now because I think every founder's gone through it, right? There's been a lull period in VC investing more
Yep.
recently, and there are several of my peers that suspect that we're now emerging out of that, the so-called tech winter, and are now merging out of that. So hopefully more venture capital can transfer hands, and companies start listing or get acquired more frequently. So it'll be interesting to see how this next period goes. Um, I have to tell you, it's one of the best times to be investing as a
Hmm.
VC. Valuations are significantly lower than they were before. Competition for deals is a lot lower. So if you're deploying capital, it's a great time to be investing. And that's part of what we do. We stay in market, we stay active as much as possible, as for as long as possible, to be able to snap up some of the best deals, no matter the cycle of the economy.
Hopefully, you have found some nuggets in the cycle that's just happened where everything slowed down. But that's always a good spot to be in if you can get better deals. You make the money in the fund go further because the valuation's at probably a reasonable level, not
Mhm.
some inflated number just because there's cheaper money floating around.
That's right, and but also the knock on effect of all that as well is, you will find that fewer startups are able to raise capital, and if fewer startups are able to raise capital, there's less competition for those types of solutions as well.
Yeah,
And
good point.
so, in many ways, it is the opportune time for entrepreneurship to occur, because there's a vacancy of everything. But it also shapes, I think, a founder's mindset and an investor's mindset to remind themselves of what are the types of qualities of a startup that are important. So it's about profitability, it's about cheap innovation, it's about cut through with customer, right? There's certain qualities, um, notwithstanding that they should continually focus on market grab, especially if they're first to market or if there are other competitors relative to them that are of equal maturity. So it is still about market grab, but yeah, it's this period we've just been through is, I think, a really great reminder of forcing everyone in this particular ecosystem to think more agile and sweat the assets you have, and not necessarily rely on that next check to always come through the door, because it won't necessarily be there.
Yeah,
Um,
it's build a focus on having a sustainable business. If you can make the
oh,
business work, then you may not need the funding necessarily
oh,
either.
for sure, for sure. I think that's how our founders built their business way back when,
Yep.
right? But it introduces, or not introduces, it encourages resilience,
Hmm.
both VCs and startups.
Yep. Charlie, it's been a really great chat.
Thank
Just
you.
conscious of the
Thanks for
time,
having
so
me.
it's been really good. If anyone wants to reach out and find out more about you, how can they do that?
A couple ways. So certainly, they can visit our website, and we have a number of contacts there. So it's www.investible.com. We're constantly in the industry, and in our office as well is at Greenhouse. Greenhouse is an invest is located in Circular Quay in Sydney, and they're happy to reach out to us that way as well.
Okay, cool. And we'll add those links in the show notes. Charlie,
Perfect.
once again, it was a really good chat, a bit eye opening there, and understanding the differences in the different cultures, and learning how you guys operate. So, thank you for your time today.
Thanks. Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the call. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.